Again, I'm so excited that you're all here. All right, let's see here. So this is a little bit about me. I like to start. I use she, her pronouns. I work at the Metropolitan State University of Denver. I'm actually a 2-time alum. So I went to Pueblo Community College, then transferred to MSU Denver. And then I got my master's at MSU Denver. And then I just recently, about 2 years ago, finished my doctorate at the University of Denver. And so I have a connection to where I work, but I also have a connection to Colorado higher ed, and especially a special place for community colleges in particular. I use she, her pronouns, identify as Indigenous and Chicana. So where my family grew up, we actually have been there since the state became a state. And so I have Apache blood from that area, as well as Chicana blood, and I identify as that using that term. I'm a cisgender woman, so I carry a privilege when I walk into spaces. I think it's important for us and for me as a presenter to unpack a little bit of my privilege when I talk. I'm a citizen. I don't have any visible disabilities. I'm also a partner. That's one of my identities. I'm a daughter, and I'm an administrator. And then I also have taught classes at the University of Denver. I'm also credentialed, which is a privilege in itself. Having the ability to have an education is such a privilege. And thinking about my ancestors and my family who lacked a lot of opportunity, but had so much potential. So a little bit about me. And then I always like to start presentations making sure that we're grounding in as we have discussions. So everything that we're going to talk about relates to equity and justice and liberation. And so when we have discussions around this, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page when discussing these issues. So if we can have some folks, if you can all see this, if folks want to just kind of popcorn and start reading what the expectations of this space for today, that would be great. Who can start first?
I can go.
Hi, Evelyn.
Hi. Speak from personal experience. Use I statements to share thoughts and feelings. You cannot speak for your group.
Thank you. I'd like to go next.
I'll jump in.
Oh.
Go ahead. I'll do the next one.
Okay. Listen respectfully, notice group dynamics, share airtime, and encourage others to participate.
Great. Thank you.
Be open to new perspectives.
Yeah.
Take risks.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yep.
Respect and maintain privacy. What's shared here stays here.
Yeah.
Expect and accept no resolution.
Yeah. Sometimes this work is just really hard and there's no resolution at the end of it. That can sometimes be frustrating.
Multiple realities exist.
Yeah, two things can be true at the same time.
Graciously receive call-ins.
Yeah, let's be thankful that we have peers that love us enough that call us in to educate us. What a great opportunity, and how thankful are we?
Personal reminders.
So what are some of the
know all there is to know?
We don't. I definitely don't.
Just because you are doesn't mean that you understand.
Mm-hmm.
Conflict and discomfort are often part of growth.
That's right. And our last one. Who wants to take us home?
I'll do it. Seek first to understand, then to be understood.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Is this something that we can all agree on for this space this morning?
Can you elaborate on personal reminders?
Oh, that was just a subsection. It was just like the next are just personal reminders.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah.
I
Cool.
like these. Yeah.
Great. All right. So my master's is in special education, and so I'm a teacher at heart, and I think it's important for us to kind of talk about what we want to take out of today. And so some of the goals that I have for us is, let me go ahead and move my little Zoom picture, is learning about different levels of policy. And so we're going to really look at federal, state, institutional, and kind of learn about those systems. And so those are huge systems. So of course, we're not going to be able to spend the whole hour and a half talking about all of those systems, but I'm going to give you a little bit of a taste of all of those systems and how they relate to community and how that relates to students. We're going to also learn ways to utilize community cultural wealth model by Yoso. And so we're going to just review that model and talk about why that's so meaningful when talking and advocating with and for our students. We're going to challenge the savior complex when being an advocate for students. And that's really hard, but we're gonna, if we can talk about that openly of what that means for us, I think that we'll be better and stronger advocates. And then I hope that we can brainstorm ideas on how to challenge deficit thinking and its reproduction. So a lot of times when lobbying, I was what I call it, right? Lobbying, asking, advocating for change for marginalized students, a lot of times it has to come in a deficit frame based upon a lot of reasons that we're going to talk about. But as advocates, we're the ones that need to challenge that narrative in a deficit way. And so we can kind of talk about how we can do that and still be successful when advocating for our students. So those are just some of the goals that I have for today. Again, we're not going to get through, we're not going to make huge decisions when things aren't going to be big because we only have an hour and a half together, but I hope to definitely plant some seeds and give you a taste of things. And of course, if you want to talk more about this afterwards, or you want to meet and have coffee when it's safe, like let's continue to have this conversation because there's just so much more here than what we can provide today. Awesome. All right. So the first thing is I'm going to talk about the 3 buckets of where policy is made. Policy is made really everywhere. If any of you are parents, you're making policies in your home and implementing those. But these are 3 policies that I'm going to be focusing on today. So we're going to first start with the broad federal policy. So we all have these broad policies. We know that they're made in DC, but there's interesting ways in which they're developed. So I don't know if any of you've taken a policy class, if you take in a political science class, a government class, I'm sure you're well aware of the ways in which Congress operates. But we have these other players. So it's not as simple as maybe the House creates a bill and sends it over to the Senate and then the president signs on it. It's much more complicated than that. And there's many more actors that play a part in the policy, what I call policy shaping. And those are lobbyists, advocates, and then what we also call IPPOs, which are intermediate public policy organizations, also known as think tanks. So those are one way to call them, to group them. And they're basically kind of middle folks. So we have the folks actually making policy, Congress, the folks you vote for, the president, but then we have folks that are influencing policy. And they're kind of middle. And then we have us at universities or communities that are actually having to implement the policy. And so they're kind of middle folks. And you can actually, that's why when you read, if you read any think tank things that come out, a lot of them are research heavy. There's a lot of briefs that come out, right, that are maybe 5 pages and pretty to the point. Because what's happening is they're catering their message really to policymakers. And so there are middle folks, and there's actually a lot of new research coming out really examining their influence of policymaking. And so I work for a TRIO program. Both of my parents were a part of TRIO programs, so I love TRIO. We have a think tank in DC. And that think tank actually helps lobby to make sure that TRIO doesn't get defunded. And so they have a very important mission to help us make connections with Congress and to make sure that if there's any bill coming out that could harm us, that they're gonna kind of like create a group to attack it. So they are very important for the success of our program for our students. In Congress, there's lots of committees, there's caucuses. So we have actually a trio caucus, which means we go and ask congressional leaders to be a part of this caucus, and they actually meet and focus and talk about trio programs. And so we call them like the champions of trio. And so a lot of times you can look at your representatives, your congressional representatives, to see what caucuses they serve on. And I think most of the time that will say what they value and what kind of issues they value. We also have the Department of, oh yeah.
Sorry about that. We had a question about trio. Someone was just curious about if you could just say more about it because they weren't familiar with trio.
Oh yeah, sure. I could talk all day about trio. Trio is a federal grant program. It started in the 60s. And basically, its whole mission is to help students that are low income first generation get in and get through to college. So there's pre-collegiate programs in middle school and high school. And then there's programs in colleges like the one that I oversee, which helps students while they're actually in college. And so again, we're grant funded. We're actually part of the Reauthorization Higher Ed Act. And so we have to be funded through Congress, but they have every right to cut our funding every year if we're not on the appropriations. And so, yeah, we have to write every 5 years to the federal government for a grant. And then within that grant, we basically say how we're going to support those students. And then there's also, there's 8 TRIO programs. I believe there's 8, there might be 7. If you're counting, they have a TRIO program where the focus just on developing TRIO professionals. But yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell. It's an access and retention program through the federal government. Cool, thank you for that. So the Department of Ed, I listed a couple of departments, and the Department of Justice. There's many other departments in DC that actually play a role. So thinking about TRIO, our program is actually organized through the Department of Ed. So we get funded through Congress, and then the folks that actually implement and oversee our program is the Department of Ed. And so every time we fill out, we have to like record data, we have to prove that we're meeting our objectives. That's who we are talking to. We're not talking to Congress. Now, we do talk to Congress every year because that's why we talk about advocating and lobbying, because they're the ones that get to make decisions about our budget. So they also play a critical role, but they're not considered an IPPO because, again, IPPOs are typically, not all of them, are bipartisan, which means that they don't really have an opinion. They do, but they're not supposed to have an opinion publicly. But there are IPPOs that definitely do have opinions and are partisan, where the Department of Education is just part of the government, if that makes sense. We also know a lot about executive orders. If you haven't heard about executive orders, there's actually been quite a bit in the past administration where the president feels like they do have the authority to just make decisions. There's some theorists that believe that that's not good for democracy if a president makes too many of those decisions, because that's why we elect officials into those roles to help be a part of those decision-making issues. And so super interesting thoughts if you're ever interested in actually talking and learning about politics, about like actually what's the right way of doing things. But yeah, I just wanted to give you kind of like a little bit about the federal government, because that's really important, especially considering that we all are affected by the federal government. So Pell, does anyone know the importance of Pell for our institutions that we work with? What is Pell?
You're talking about the Pell Grant?
The Pell Grant, yeah.
Which would identify, it's a certain amount of money that families can make, and if families make below that, they qualify for the funding for different federal programs. It's a big part of our financial aid.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a big deterrent or opportunity creator for college, right? Access for students. And so the Pell Grant actually has a really interesting history. And that was created and approved by Congress. But there's been presidents and folks in Congress that have kind of changed the ways in which the Pell Grant was intended to be. And so we actually are giving out way less money now than we've ever given out. And so that's super problematic because our tuition continues to rise because we don't have funding from a state level to help support our colleges and institutions. So yeah, so that's something that the federal government plays a huge role. If we're not meeting certain federal requirements as an institution, the threat is always they'll take away our Pell eligibility. They'll take away our financial aid, and that would destroy an institution. And so also thinking about their power and how their influence in how we manage our own internal policies is also something that's important. The reauthorization of the Higher Ed Act is also really important for higher ed. There's a lot of stuff in there, thrown in there. And so I even think the Pell grant is thrown in there. But that's super important, and that's actually expired. But we have this process at the federal government, which basically allows bills that have expired to just kind of continue to go until they have the time to work on them. And that one's a really big one. That one's going to take some time. Actually, I think they were working pretty hard on it before the pandemic hit, and then it kind of took the back burner, which is understandable. And also like, we need them to continue to work on that one. But that's how you also, go ahead.
Dr. Garcia, since you did mention the pandemic, can you speak to the fact that TRIO grants mean that counselors have to contact students directly? And so that's part of the criteria to continue funding. And because of the pandemic, they can't do that. What's in place now to address that?
Yeah, I mean, so they're allowing the like Zoom or team meetings to count. Phone calls have always been able to count. It's really any connection point. So even if you have like, if you're able to meet with them on a Teams, that's considered a contact. It's not as great, right? Because part of the TRIO program also is having the ability to talk about culture and to be in a space and to have, to be with each other, to share a meal together. And we haven't been able to do that. So we know that that's been really challenging, not just for TRIO programs, but for any retention program that serves marginalized students. That's really been hard. Also, right, our students and their families have had to navigate the ripple effects of COVID at more alarming rates, or even harder than maybe are the counterparts of white students whom are maybe middle income or above. And so we know that the pandemic has even added that extra twist, that they're navigating even harder things without having maybe that necessary community support that they're used to on campus. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any questions kind of about the federal government? So we have a new administration moving in, and what happens is that the new administration basically, like, if they don't like how the old administration ran, they get to like fix and change and do all those things. So that's kind of like the state we're in right now, is that like the Department of Ed still hasn't gotten like the exact like direction that this administration wants to go. They probably have objectives or things they'd like to see change, but they haven't implemented those quite yet. And so we're waiting to hear what this means as the new administration rolls in. And so we'll continue, and institutions will continue to have different things happen because of a new administration and the ways in which they interpret, and then the ways in which they govern in those areas. So it's an interesting time because things now has the ability to be different. I am going to talk about something called a policy window. And so now is what a lot of folks would consider a policy window. This usually happens when things change. But I want to talk about the three streams that kind of create the policy window. So we will get there. But it's an interesting time to talk about policy windows. And so now more than ever would be a great time to advocate for your students because of this policy window that might be open because of the transition of a new administration. Cool. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the state government. We still elect folks. So hopefully you all vote. This is a little like push, like please vote for your elected officials and from the state. And they, in Colorado in particular, they have quite a bit of control over the state budget. They do the state budget, and that impacts higher education. So that's not necessarily going to impact my TRIO federal program because my money is coming from the federal government, but it is still going to impact my TRIO students' experience on campus because of the institution and their funding and what access they have to funds and to programming. So the state has a lot of control over state budgets. And in Colorado, we have a funding formula, and it's pretty complicated, so we're not going to go through that, but it does talk a lot about graduation rates in there. So institutions that are maybe community colleges or comprehensive regional colleges like MSU Denver, Adams State, CSU Pueblo, sometimes have a harder time keeping up with the graduation rates. And why do you think that would be? Why do you think that our graduation rates might be lower if we're looking at 4-year or 5-year graduation rates compared to maybe other colleges that, I don't know, I'll just pick on DU since I went to DU, like DU or CU. Why do you think there's difference in those graduation rates?
I think that our student populations are vastly different, and that might have something to do with it, but I'm also thinking about just particularly the funding, and I don't know the right answer. I work at MSU Denver, and I know that that's one of the institutions that doesn't, quite stand out in the state, but I want to say like maybe the funding as well, because we don't get as much funding. I don't know.
No, that's great. Yeah, it's cyclical, right? So we don't get the funding. So community colleges, comprehensive regional universities, folks that typically are more open access to students. So they're not like going to require ACT scores. They're not going to require like high GPAs in high school. They're not going to require 20 letters of recommendation. And they're also more affordable in comparison. So maybe students don't have to take out as many loans. Maybe Pell will cover most of the tuition if they get full Pell. So yes, all of those things are, those colleges usually cater or are more accessible to those student populations. And in turn, those are the lowest funded schools in Colorado. So they don't have as much options to build out programming. And then they're also potentially having students come in that maybe need more support, which is understandable. They might be first in their family. They might be, socioeconomics they might be low socioeconomic standards. They might have a disability. And so the list goes on and on and on. And the reason also too is a lot of these regional comprehensive universities also serve the community. And so they're placed in an area that serves that area, and that's their job and that's their mission. And so a lot of like folks won't, want to leave their home and go somewhere and pay out-of-state tuition because they want to stay home. And that's also a cultural belief too, of staying home, maybe paying, working and helping the family, succeed. And so that's a more accessible place if they could just stay home and then go to that college. And so you're right, it's cyclical. It's both and. We don't get enough money to support. And then also a lot of the times these colleges are some of the only colleges in the area that can fit their financial budget and are accessible to their lifestyle and their needs of their family. And so, yeah, it's super interesting and disappointing that that's how it kind of functions. So schools like that have a lower rate of a four-year graduation, especially if a student is working full-time. They're maybe only taking part-time classes, so they're not going to graduate in 4 years. And that's okay, right? But it then becomes something that's negative on the institution when it comes to funding. So that's super problematic. So one thing that we could all do is we could all say, this funding formula is wrong, or we shouldn't be considering, you know, a 5-year graduation rate. We should be looking at a 7 or 8-year graduation rate. We should be looking at how many students stay in Colorado and get jobs in Colorado. There's lots of different ways in which we can determine funding, and your voices and your expertise in working with students is really needed when creating this type of policy. And so, yeah, so that was just one example. I don't know if any of you know, the Colorado is actually called, it's called DuPont West. So in DC, where lots of educational policy is being created, those IPPOs, the street name is DuPont. So that's the street name in DC. They have labeled all these like folks that talk about policy, higher ed policy, have labeled Colorado as DuPont West, because Colorado is the second largest place that has IPPOs and is doing educational policy. So it's DC and then Colorado, which is really cool. So we're actually in a really cool place to be making substantial change to higher education policy. So one of the things, and I just forgot about two of them, I just thought of them, but I will tell you them. So the first one is SHIOs. That also plays into the Colorado, the ways in which we govern higher ed in Colorado. So SHIOs is the higher ed, the state higher ed education executive officer organization. So basically it's the head, our SHIO is the head of the Colorado State Department of Higher Education. So that person is our SHIO. And that person, basically their job, they have a very big job, is to kind of take policy from the federal government, analyze it, also be figuring out Colorado state policy, helping analyze that, and then telling institutions how they're interpreting it and what to do. So they have a really big job. And so a lot of times, like, universities rely on the Colorado Department of Higher Ed for guidance. And that's their job, is to guide. It's not to lobby, it's not to push out change. Their job is to really guide institutions on how to implement policy changes. And so the SHIO is actually all of the higher ed leaders. There's different folks with different names in different states, depending on how they're governed and how that's set up. But SHIO lives in Boulder, Colorado, and they talk to all of the SHIOs around the country and give them support as they're trying to navigate really challenging things happening in their state. And so that's super cool. If any of you are interested, he sat on my dissertation committee, but Dr. David Tamberg is the vice president, associate vice president, some bigwig in SHIO who's amazing and was also a tenured faculty member at Florida State University, I believe. And he's phenomenal. So if you ever want to read any of his stuff, he writes a lot about policy. He also is really into financial aid and Pell. And he also went to Adams State University, which is really great. So he cares very much. He sits on their board now. And so he's great. So if anyone ever wants to talk to him, I TA'd with him, I taught a class with him, we worked on some other projects together. He's so knowledgeable. I always learn something from him, but he's a really big into the SHIO, and that's his specialty. Tabor plays a huge role in the state. You know, it's really interesting. I don't know if any of you know the history of Tabor, but basically, in a nutshell, it was somebody's idea, and they actually had proposed this idea to many different state officials in different states. And people were like, other states were like, no, 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 no. But Colorado, we seem to like it. And we've had one heck of a time unwinding that mess and what that means for education. So if you're not fully aware of the implications of Tabor, it basically doesn't, it's called the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, and it doesn't allow us to increase taxes without taxpayer approval. And a lot of times people are like, no, I don't want to pay more taxes, even if it's like $10, $20. They don't want to pay any more taxes, but what they don't understand is that it has a significant ripple effect on our education system. And so that's really been challenging and been really, really hard for the state of Colorado. Gallagher is another issue that talks about property taxes that's also super complicated, that plays a role in education that we've struggled with as well. And so those play a role in Colorado not having a lot of money for higher ed as well. Another big issue in the state of Colorado is that K through 12 funding is in our Constitution. So that is in our state constitution. So we have to fund K through 12 education, even if we do it pretty poorly, because we also do that poorly as a state. And so if there's any money left, then we can throw it to higher education. But we absolutely have to fund K through 12. So what this kind of does to the landscape of Colorado is you have community colleges fighting against four-year universities for scraps of money. You have K through 12 fighting against higher ed for scraps of money. And then you have big universities competing against smaller open access universities for big chunks of money. And so we're all just fighting each other to get money every single year. And how that happens is our presidents, our vice presidents are talking to policymakers, they're giving speeches, they're putting out briefs during this time. So I'm sure you actually have this going on at your university right now. What's also happening is that universities hire lobbyists. So we have lobbyists. Usually every institution has some type of lobby handle because they need someone that's going to be at the Capitol speaking on behalf of the institution. Always. They need someone like in those meetings. They need someone to say like, well, what about this institution? The problem is that there's even inequities within that. So you can Google it. This is public knowledge, but some institutions in the state of Colorado have many more lobbyists than others. So I think MSU Denver has one. We have one lobbyist. And then I think CU Boulder at one point had 10. So if you have one lobbyist going in and saying like, please, 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 here's all the data, look at this, and then you have 10, how much more power do you think the people that have 10 have over the one person? There's only so much one person can do versus 10 people. And so additionally, we'll talk about this later on too, but a lot of the people that actually work for the state and work for the federal government that are actually making these policies and making these budget decisions went to the larger institutions. They went to the private institutions. They went to the large state institutions. And so that's their alma mater. And so they're like, oh yeah, like I totally want to give money back to them. That's why it's also important to get your students active in doing these things, running for office, get them active in student government, because we need more people running the government that have and come from their experiences. That's what we need, because they're going to be the ones being like, hold up, what about these community colleges that do so much for the community? Why aren't we going to fund them? We need those voices there. And so that's also super interesting. Another place that I didn't put on my slide here is ECS, Educational Commissions of the State. They are fabulous for finding data. So their whole job is I think they do P through 20, but maybe it's only K through 20. They work with every state of pooling data. So if a state's like, hey, I'm thinking I want to do a policy similar to Colorado. Colorado has this cool policy. Can you pull all the data from that and give me that? That's what they work with the state in order to help them make better policy decisions. They actually, if you I always subscribe to their newsletter. And I'll put some of these at the end in our chat to these newsletters, but you can also go to their website and say like, I'm looking for a policy around first generation, I don't know, first year experience courses or something. Like, what's the data around retention for that? You can maybe plug that in and they'll be able to find you some resources for you to be able to use. So they're super accessible. They're really great people and they really influence policy. And that's right downtown Denver, right at our fingertips. We also have some other folks in Boulder that do great stuff as well, not only SHIO. So again, Colorado is the second largest place that are working on policy related to higher ed. And so this is a great place for you all to be. Another thing is very similar to the federal government, but just wanted to say that there are committees and that's the ripple effect of other issues is also really important to acknowledge in the federal, state, and institutional. So if you are, although it's not higher ed directly, it's still important for us to know what's happening in housing. It's still important for us to know what's happening with public assistance, SNAP programs. And the reason is because all of those things are connected to our students and their community. And that is going to eventually be something that's connected to their education as well. So one of the things that happens a lot is, just focusing on higher education policy, but I'm going to encourage everyone to focus on all social policy, anything that affects students, because it does have such a large ripple effect on their ability to access education. Cool. All right, let's talk a little bit about institutional. So you all either work at some type of, and I'm saying broad, casting broad strokes here of what institution means. It's basically like a smaller place doing smaller policy work. And so a lot of times you have your own internal policies, right? If a student, I'll give you like a faculty one, if a student misses 2 classes, they automatically get a B in the class. That's an institutional policy created probably by the staff or the faculty senate that was probably approved. But then there's also like federal policy that the institution is trying to navigate that's probably being pushed down from the Department of Higher Education, trying to help them guide what's right, which was told to them by the federal government. And so you're doing a lot of things. You're creating your own, and then you're implementing, and then you're trying to assess and make sure that you're not out of compliance. So your institution is constantly is in policy mode all the time. Are we out of compliance here? Do we need to create a new policy here? And then maybe there's new policies being created and pushed on institutions. One of the ones that our institution and probably every institution in Colorado regarding hiring practices is this new policy that just was official in January, where it really talked about you can't promote within. You have to actually now basically like you just can't promote within because it's unfair. And there's like this fair equity promotion policy now within the state. And so our institution's trying to navigate what that means. They're trying to like read into that. And so every institution is probably in the same boat of trying to navigate this new policy and what that means. And then talking a lot about money matters and going back to what Evelyn said, it's a lot to manage. So making sure that we're in compliance, creating new policies, and then potentially trying to change policies on the fly or trying to interpret them takes a lot of people power. And many times institutions that are lower funded just simply don't have as much staff to do this work. And so money really does matter in the place of when implementing institutional policies, simply for the ability to actually do it well and right. And so it can be a very exhausting thing to do. Yeah, so I just wanted to mention that. Questions? I'm talking a lot. I promise there's going to be time for you all to talk soon.
I was just kind of reflecting about what you said of the job of the lobbyists. Like, I didn't realize that institutions had lobbyists that they paid to go and sit in these meetings. I know that I know what a lobbyist is, but I didn't know from you. Actually, I didn't know that before I knew you. But I'm thinking about the university presidents and how much like information we get from our president about like, you know, how unfair everything is and stuff. And I'm thinking like how much time she's spending in this particular issue versus any other university president that might have time to be focused on other things, you know, like I think about that in terms of inequity too, of like, you know, I know that being in the community is super important. So how much time does our president have to do that versus like having to focus on these
Sure.
things?
I think you bring up a really good point, Evelyn. Like, it is such a privilege, right, to be able to maybe not spend or think about funding because you either have the ability to hire people to help you or because you have such large endowments that it's really not that big of an issue for your institution. I will say that every institution, though, even if they have large endowments, will continue to like lobby for more money. And so it probably won't stop. I don't really see an institution being like, I think we're good. I think we're just gonna like not show up to those meetings because I think we're fine this year. I think no matter what, people will still be trying to grab their share of the pot. So, but I think you're right. It brings up a really interesting, like, folks that do serve regional comprehensive universities or community colleges oftentimes are having to spin their wheels in other areas because they have to, versus like the ability to do other things that might be beneficial for the university. Yeah, good thinking. So I kind of talked about this before about how social issues connect. And so when thinking about how all of the policies that are being created, the laws, the things that are happening regarding even the stimulus check that might be happening at the federal government, those are all going to have a ripple effect on our students and their ability to be successful in school. So if you have students now who are really struggling with money because they lost their job, maybe their family lost their job, any type of stimulus checks that the federal government gives could potentially be the reason that they stay in college, could potentially be the reason that they graduate earlier, could potentially be the reason that they take less loans. And so all of these things have pretty big influences of their ability to be successful in retaining in college. So I think it's just an important reminder to continuously challenge yourself to be in the know or to research, to read about all social policy as it has effects on our students. So I kind of already talked about this a little bit, but the political landscape and realities. And so a lot of folks that are making policy, and if you ever watch any folks in the federal government when they're actually doing call outs and they're voting, it's a little challenging now because folks are wearing masks and like not everyone can be there. But if you typically watch how that happens in session, if you ever go to our state capitol and see session, or if you've ever testified for a bill, you see the chaos happening. But you also see not a lot of racial diversity. You see not a lot of different ethnicities. You don't see a lot of folks from this various ages. Like typically in the federal government, you don't see a lot of folks that are that young. You just don't. It's usually you see a lot of older folks that have been there. That's their whole career is politics, and they've been there for 30, 20, 30, 50 years. And we have, you all know what kind of politicians who I'm talking about for that. Even our current president has been a politician for majority of his life. And so there's not a lot of new blood that gets pushed into these spaces. There's also not a lot of folks typically that come from like low income socioeconomic status, because you have to fundraise and you have to, do the grassroots thing, and you have to, but typically if you come from middle class or above, you have connections and your family has connections, and you're able to fundraise more money. And so money is always an issue with folks as well. I talked about the alma mater, and that's something that's super important to know, is that folks usually, especially at a federal level, have gone to pretty prestigious institutions. And so their life and their experience at an institution was very much the stereotypical experience of an institution. So they probably didn't have to work. They probably stayed in the dorms. They potentially had a really good time. They probably, were able to take courses that they maybe didn't need and had to pay more. Like, they probably just really got to have that again, that stereotypical, what we see in movies, college experience, that a lot of our students that we work with don't get to have. And so when they make decisions or they're talking about policy changes, they really have no idea the experience of other students because their experience was so privileged. And so that's important knowledge to know, especially when you talk to congressional leaders or their aides. It's important for you to know that they might be coming in and being very knowledgeable about the current situation. There's also a lot of folks in these positions that maybe went to college during a time where Pell, if you qualified, paid for a huge majority of your tuition at a state college. And maybe all they needed to do was work in the summer and then pay off that rest of the amount. So they come from this knowledge thinking, well, we're already helping you. Like, I don't know what else you want. Like we're doing so much for you, because their experiences was very different. What they haven't understood is the changes of levers where Pell has actually gone down, the amount of Pell, and tuition has risen. And so it's actually really hard for a student to just pay out of pocket by working a summer job to meet that gap. And so educating folks in these areas is really important, and doing it without potentially offending them is also important as well. So that's something that we're going to talk about too. Cool. And I spelled some words wrong, sorry. Okay, so I wanted to go back to this thought of a policy window, which I think we're in a really cool policy window right now. And this is a theory, a policy theory. And I just wanted to put the folks that I got this actual visual from at the bottom. This is not a visual that I made. But basically, a policy window is created when you have three streams that come together. So you have a problem, and there's many problems that we can call out right now, like an epidemic. So there's the problem. Maybe students are not able to afford college, like that's a problem. And then potentially there's some policies, either like new technologies to solve problems. Maybe there's, I don't know, some new ideas coming, being created. And so that's like, those are some things that are happening. So I'm thinking about like DACA is happening. Like, you know what I mean? Like that's something that's on the president's agenda, is to work and fix DACA. I mean, I also hope they work on the side of fixing the immigration system, because that's really what needs the attention. But that's on the president's agenda to fix. So that's potentially a policy to help fixing a problem. And then you have the politics. So again, we have a change in government. We have new folks in new roles who might have very different opinions about how to manage and implement, and the things that they didn't like about certain policies, and they actually have the power to make change in those positions. So all of those three streams coming together actually create this window of potential change. And so I'm thinking now is definitely a time where we could say, and what that means is that you can go and say, if you're going to create this new policy, or this is an old policy, I want you to fix this piece of it. This piece of it isn't working. And I'm going to push, now that you're all trying to change that policy, I'm going to push now to see if we can actually get that permanently changed, or whatever that looks like. And so yeah, so I do think we're in a very big like policy window stage. I study Title IX, and I think that that's also in a policy window of potentially with the new Department of Ed, the new president. I think that there's definitely a policy window to that. Questions on a policy window? And this again isn't just for federal. This is like state policy windows. These are institutional policy windows. I'm sure there's a policy window even in your own home when things aren't going well. Yeah, cool. All right, so this is where we're going to talk about food. So how I thought about advocacy is really thinking about it as a combination plate, and really thinking about creating your combination plate. And so I obviously love food. I'm from Pueblo. We have this known rivalry with having the best green chili. In New Mexico we have a Hatch or Pueblo green chili. It's like a thing. And so don't tell anyone, but I still like Hatch better. But I'm supposed to say I like Pueblo better. I know, don't say anything. And so we also have this thing in Pueblo called tacos on white. And I cannot get any tacos on white up here, but they're basically deep fried chicken tacos. And they're delicious. And you can get them pretty much in any Mexican restaurant in Pueblo. And there's thousands of Mexican restaurants in Pueblo. And so I thought we would kind of talk about some tangible things that you can take away and some of the things that you really need to do when advocating at any of the levels, when creating that agenda for you to advocate. And so I'm going to do it in a combo plate. We're going to make our own combo plates of what you need to have. All right. So again, I kind of talked about this. The first thing that you really need to think about is who you are. And so who you are and who are your ancestors, who are your relatives, what are their experiences, what are your experiences in higher education, what's your community, how will these decisions be impacted, and why is that important to you? And so that's like some of the first things that you need to do. And I think you need to do that because you're going to be going into spaces that are very white and that are very Eurocentric and that are purposely created for people that look like us and the communities like us to enter. I mean, there are systematic things that have happened to prevent us from being in those spaces of making change. And so as you enter these spaces, you're often going to feel frustrated, angry, sad, maybe disappointed. And so it's going to be really important that you find a way to ground yourself in this work, knowing that it's not going to change overnight, but that you know who you are and why you're doing this. So I just wanted to kind of preface that's super important, because again, you're going to be navigating very colonized spaces. You always want to center your community and you always want to center your ancestors. And I do that all the time. I have rings that I wear with me every time I go and I lobby. I've probably lobbied like 12 times to Congress. And this represents my family. This is a family ring. This one says they didn't know we were seeds. And this is an indigenous ring that was given to me by a chief. And I wear these to empower me when I go into those spaces. So to remind myself of who I am and why I'm doing this. Cool. All right.
Ali?
Yes.
Sorry for the interruption, but I love what you just said.
Oh, yeah.
Honoring our ancestors. That's fundamental in life. I loved it. I love it. I love it. I love it.
Yay.
Thank you, Ali. Gracias.
Yes, of course.
Sorry for the interruption.
No, that's great. So every meal that I go to, when I go to Pueblo, always on the side is rice and beans. And I can, I think about my dad who says that he grew up just eating beans because that's all they could afford. And so beans have these beautiful, like nurturing, healing powers that I feel that beans have. And in Colorado, my family used a lot of pinto beans, Black beans can also mean that to you. So I have pictures of pinto beans because that's something that's very dear to me in my spirit. I also love the picture of beans being cooked. I get so excited when I see, so I put that one in there because I was like, oh, I love the way that beans look when they're about ready to be cooked. So I talk about beans and rice as being part of your combination plate. And the reason is because when you pick beans, a lot of times you want to research where you go. I mean, my parents pick where they want to go. They know where they get their beans. They oftentimes have picked and harvested their own beans. Then you go home and you sort your beans, right? You wash and rinse. Some people like to put their beans overnight. You cook them, and they take sometimes a really long time to cook. And then you season. If I'm making refried beans, then then I go back and refry them, and I serve. And of course, I put some fat in there. And so that's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. So the thing that reminds me of beans is that this is going to take a lot of work. So advocacy is the same, and you're going to have to prep. You're going to have to research. You're going to have to research who you're talking to, who has power in this space to make a decision. What were there other policies or other things that they supported that are similar to this? Where they're not? Are they pretty anti X, Y, and Z? And so you have to do your research. So qual, quant, you have to have data. They love data. And one of the things that they really love is they love quant data. So I always bring some quant data, right? So like our charts, our numbers, but then I will never not take stories, because stories is part of who we are as a people. And so it is important to share the impact and the stories of our students. And whenever I go, I usually take like a picture. I'll take students' work that they have approved for me to share. We would love to take students actually sharing their own story. That's really important because congressional leaders have a hard time ignoring that. And they also have to understand that they work for the people. And so them ignoring those stories could cost them their job. And so that's important. One of the things I put in here, so, my mom does most of the cooking when I see her. She makes all of our traditional meals. And I remember one time I decided to make the rice, Spanish rice, and I burned it. Because you got to know what you're doing. And I obviously messed up. And so one of the things I put in here is to don't burn the rice. And what I mean by that is you want to be so intentional when you go into these spaces that you don't burn any bridges. And because you never know who can be your ally. And I can give you this story. We took a student to lobby a couple of years ago. And this was when former Representative Tipton used to oversee Pueblo in their congressional district. And the student said, "Hey, do you remember me?" And Tipton was like, I don't have time. Like, I'm busy. And he's like, "Oh, hello." Like, we were waiting at the, and this wasn't me. This was a story told to me. They were waiting at the elevator. And he's like, "Okay, like what? Like 5 minutes, like 2 minutes, like, right?" And that's how you do it. You sometimes have to ambush congressional leaders at the federal government. You like go to the bathroom and then they're there. And then you're like, "Hey, here's an opportunity to tell you about how great my program is and how great my students are. I'd love to do a follow-up." Like, you take every opportunity to talk to them. And so the student said, "Do you remember me?" And he was like, "No." So the student went ahead and said that when Representative Tipton was a prosecutor, that he had prosecuted this student and basically said, "You're not going to be anything. You're just going to go to jail. And I don't believe you have a future." And the student said, "You told me that." And then I got out. I went back to school. I got a part of a TRIO program and I graduated. And now I'm starting a master's in social work, social worker counseling. And I just wanted to remind you that you said that. And I wanted to also let you know that TRIO works. And that was like, and so the elevator kept going and he kept like ignoring the elevator. And so because of that, like his story was like changed him. Like, and so that was super impactful for him to hear. And so we just never know who our allies will be. He landed up signing, I think, on the letter of appropriations that year, and just really becoming an advocate for TRIO. He was, and so we have many stories like that from the TRIO Nation that really talk about how we have to enter spaces, we have to do our research, and we have to be prepared, but also know how courageous sometimes we have to be in pushing back. And that's why we have to be grounded with our ancestors and our history, and we have to be confident walking in there. So just wanted to share that with you. Some of the things I talked about, the importance of communication. I talk a lot about this with combos of my mom. So you kind of have to do what I do with my mom, with anybody that has power, is you have to constantly be reminding them and telling them things. So my poor mom, I text her, I call her when every little thing that has happened in my life, she knows about. And so, oh mom, I'm just getting tea right now. Just wanted to see how you're doing. Oh, I decided to go for a run today. Just wanted to see how you're doing. I mean, be like me to congressional leaders. Send them an email. This is what three of our students, were selected for this award. We just wanted to let you know, hey, we know that you're going to be in town. So congressional leaders come back to their state in the summer. Invite them on your campus. Let them come see your students. Invite them for a lunch. Let them be a guest speaker. Come show them all the good work that they're missing, and why they need to be supportive of your program and your students. And let your students talk. Let them say. Give them that opportunity. Give them that agency. But I always constantly be trying to communicate with anyone that has power for policy, anyone that has power at your own institution. You know who those folks are. Be reminding them, hey, look at what my students did. Look at how great that they are. Look at all the wonderful things that they've done. Aren't they so accomplished? Wow, we're so proud of them. And it's important that you constantly do that, because you're setting yourself up to them say, hey, I remember you talked about that. Do you have the data for me I want to take this to so-and-so, or, do you have an idea about fixing this problem? You also become an expert in that area, which I think we can all consider ourselves experts on campus with working with our students. Text message style. So congressional leaders don't like anything big. You got to do it text message style. So do it bullet points, get to the point. They want to hear the meat. They don't have time because there's so many things happening to get anything more than that. And then remember that it's okay sometimes to leave where you feel like, wow, that did not go as well as I thought it would go. Or there's still so much resistance in changing this, and it's really disappointing. Your goal is to build accomplices, and your goal is to plant seeds. You may not see the fruits of your labor all the time, but the idea is that the following year you come back and you can say, hey, remember me? Yeah, I still have that problem. Yeah. And so what's really great is now when I go and I talk to congressional representative DeGette, their aide is like, oh, hey, Allie. Oh, what's up, Allie? They already know my name. And I was like, hey, did you get that letter of appropriations? I remember one time I had one for HSIs and for TRIO. And he's like, well, we signed both of them, so you don't have to come back for the second one. And I was like, oh, perfect. So it's important that you have those relationships, because you're like, hey, I still have this problem. Also, what's really cool is at one point, Representative Kaufman, who's no longer in that position, emailed me and said, I want to come visit MSU Denver, but I want to come visit this certain program. But called me, their aide called me and said, yeah, we have a connection to MSU Denver. And so that's also super impactful and important, because now maybe I could say, well, I'll call you next time I have a problem and need some help. So these things are really important. And again, you're building accomplices and you're planting seeds, and you may not see the fruits of your labor. And that's really hard, but that's also what our ancestors did for us. right? They worked extremely hard to get us to the next step. And a lot of them didn't get to see the fruits of that labor. And so we're passing that on. All right. Want to get into the community cultural wealth model. So kind of talking about when we do go have these conversations with folks, what are we capitalizing on? What are we highlighting? And so I'm using the work of Yoso, specifically an article from 2005. But there's also another edition by Redon, and that's from 2014, and that's the Latino cultural wealth model. We're not going to get into that. I wanted to give you the Yoso's work, but I encourage you to take a look at that work as well. Is anyone familiar with this community cultural wealth model? Yeah. Okay, great. So I'm just
Yes.
going to go through. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
I'm going to go through it very quickly. But basically, it's this idea. So the colonized way is that, you know, students have a certain type of capital when they come in, and typically that's in a very negative showing of our students, like that our students don't come with any capital, like, and that's like financial capital, that's like having any connection capital, right? Like maybe their family are not 7th generation to Harvard. And so there's always been this like negative deficit saying like, oh, those poor kids, they don't have any capital when they come into college. And what I love about Yoso's work is like, Yoso was like, are you kidding me? They come with a ton of capital. How dare you? And so they created this wonderful way for us to really challenge our own thoughts about what capital means. This is actually a really great activity that you can do with students. So I do this with our student staff in TRIO, and we go through, and their job is to write down all of their capital that fit in these areas to remind them how capable they are of doing this, that they can do this. And so basically, like some big ones here that I think is really great is that resistance capital. So a lot of our families and students, they come with capital of knowing how to resist, how to advocate, how to ask questions, because they've now had to navigate so many white colonized systems in order to just move forward. So that's great capital that they come with. They know how to do that. This linguistic capital, right? They can communicate in more than one language, many of our students. That's beautiful that they have that ability to switch and to interpret. That is such an asset, which is interesting because now a lot of folks are noticing that that's an asset. And whereas before, you know, like my grandparents, like they didn't want to, you know, they don't want me to learn Spanish. Like they were like, do not do that. Like, do not speak Spanish in public. Like don't do that. Assimilate. I think another big one is the familial capital, right? That we have strong bonds to our family. Family doesn't have to be blood. Family can mean a lot in our culture. And that's super important for us. And that's a beautiful thing. And our students bring that. And they bring that with them when they come to college. Yeah, so these are some of the things. Again, I encourage you to read that article. It's great, it's fabulous. And it's also really important to acknowledge that our students they do have capital, and they do have a lot of things that they're bringing with them that make them very capable of being successful in college. And oftentimes we have to be the ones to remind them of that. And we have to be the ones to challenge the systems that tell them otherwise. Cool. I then want to talk a little bit about no saviors, which is this idea of the savior complex, which often I have to challenge myself on, because I care so immensely about my community and my family and marginalized students. And because I've had the privilege and opportunity to have degrees and seek educational experiences, oftentimes I tiptoe around the savior complex. And the savior complex is basically this idea that we want to save people. And And we do, in a sense, we do want to help communities, right? I don't know if we all want to save them, but we do deeply want to help them and change them. And sometimes that gets to a point where we feel like we have to step in, especially in the advocacy role, where we do step in. And we have to like take on challenges for them, take on systems for them, which I think is appropriate at times and needed at times. But there is a fine line where sometimes we're doing it that can be harmful to the student, to the community, when it's more, if it turns into something more about us than the community. And so I think constantly having to challenge yourself. And one of the things that I say is the community speaking through me. Am I being the catalyst for my community? And if I'm not, and if I haven't talked to my community, or I haven't talked to the student experience that I'm talking about, then I need to do my research a little bit better. And I need to go back to the community to actually hear what they want, and hear their say and hear their input. So I think it's just important to always remember who we work for, what our goals are, and then going back to that beginning of grounding yourself in why you're doing this. You'll see this happen a lot. You see saviorism happen a lot with folks that maybe don't have the same experience that our students do. They just feel so bad for our students that they just want to save them. And I think it's an important thing to talk about when advocating for students, is how are we not here to save them, but how are we here to empower them? How are we here to, if they need our help navigating a system, that we are an accomplice in this work? But how are we here not to like save them? And that's tough. That's tricky. And that's something that you'll have to like think about. And every situation will probably be very different. All right, so now we are going to you're going to have time to make your own combination plate of how you would maybe enter a policy change conversation, either at your institution, if you're thinking of a state policy that you don't like or is harmful for student populations, federal. So you're going to pick one, and basically then you're going to create your plate. So I just did some entrees here. So remember that, so either tacos, tostadas, or burritos will be your qual research. So, say like, yeah, I'm going to pick a taco and I'm going to interview 3 student stories about their experience in I don't know, a private school, a predominantly white private school, because I'm concerned about a certain policy that, I don't know, that pushes students of color into going to only, private schools in Colorado. Say that was a policy. And so maybe that was what you would do for a qual. Then you can say, I'll take a chile relleno and I'm going to do some calculations, and I'm going to take some data around that policy that would prove that this is super problematic. And then what are you gonna, what's the side? So you have your beans and rice, but how are you gonna prep for the policy shapers? You should be researching these policy folks and the policies that they've passed. Where did they grow up in Colorado? What high school did they go to? What are some of their experiences? If it's not federal or state, maybe you can research your institution. Where do they work? What do they like to study? What are some of the things that they have, pushed for in the past? And then you're going to find your rice. So what is some of the commonality that you're going to build this collaboration on? Because you don't want to burn it. So what are some of the things, even if, there's some congressional leaders that I'm like, we have no commonality. I have no idea how I'm going to present this to you, but I have to look and I have to search and I have to say, sometimes I have to say things that it's not my favorite way to say it. So one of the things that we often say is that TRIO works because TRIO helps folks get off of, governmental assistance, because it gives them a college degree, potentially a salary, and it helps with upward mobility. I don't love saying that because I don't think there's anything wrong with being as my family has been on assistance before in their life, and there's nothing wrong with that. And so I personally, ethically don't think that that's not how I like to enter that space, but that's how I know they're going to hear me in that space. And so finding your commonality for pushing the change is going to be your race. And then I put in there, if you want it smothered, you want to talk about your history. So green chili is really important in my family. I mean, I don't even know my mom's recipe because she's like, if I give it to you, it has to stay in the family. Like, this is secret. This is like top secret stuff here. And so I think it's thinking about, if you want your food smothered, what's the history of this policy? Maybe it's like super old and it's a pretty racist policy, which is pretty common, that you may want to talk about, of like, we are past this. We need to be a better community. Like, this is wrong. I also always say, make sure that the tacos are not soggy and the plate looks like grandma made it. So whenever you're presenting, make sure that you practice, make sure that you're polished, make sure that you show up and that you are ready to really present what you have to say and that you're powerful. And so those are some things to think about when making your plate. Are there questions? Again, I can't see the chat. Oh, wait, maybe I can. I can. Awesome. Does everyone know what they're doing? Okay. I have no idea what time it is. I have no idea how much time I have. Oh my gosh, it's 11:30 already. We like barely don't even have any time to do this. Okay. Sorry. Well, hopefully maybe in the chat, maybe just process what would be on your combo plate and why that's important. So why would an enchilada that talks about quant work, why would that be important when discussing a policy change? So maybe just pick one. And then I'm going to move on because we definitely don't have. I was going to have you all share your plates, your order with us. I'm so sad. I want to share some books with you all, and then we can take questions. I'm happy to stay longer. I know y'all are so busy because you're probably doing a million things. So if you need to go, feel free to go. But I do want to share some books. There is a lobbying book that's really excellent, super old, and it's also not critical. I'm a critical scholar, so it could probably be rewritten, but it does show a lot of great pointers when lobbying for higher ed. So I don't know what I did with that book, but I don't have that book to show you, but I will put that in the chat if you're interested in finding out more about the actual lobbying process and what that looks like. This is a great book on being included. It talks about racism and diversity in institutional life. Great book for you to kind of understand that aspect a little bit better. I mean, I'm sure you already understand that aspect because you experience it, but this will give you some maybe language to help challenge cultural norms. So this is one about SHIOs. If you're interested in SHIOs, this one's really great. And so the State Higher Education Executive Officer and the Public Good. So they really talk about the role of SHIOs and really how hard their job is and what they're navigating. And I think that's kind of interesting too when we think about policy. This is always just like a must, right? Pedagogy of the Oppressed, just a must. I always try to read it maybe once every couple of years because I'm like, oh yeah, that's so good. Gosh, that's so good. I relate to that. I put a couple of books around culture because again, that helps ground you. This has got to be my favorite book, Rain of Gold. I touched this book when I was writing my dissertation, whenever I like needed to feel like I could do this. And this is just such a good book. So if you're looking of something just to like give you some cultural like oomph and like, yes, like this is who we are, highly recommend this book. Same thing, this is actually a writer, an MSU Denver alum, and heard really great things. I have not finished this book, but it's about, I think, Latinx experiences in Colorado and in Denver in particular. And so that might be something that you want to read too. Again, I haven't finished it, but I like it so far. So there's that one. When talking about policy stuff, this is really good. So what I didn't get to talk about is how you actually analyze policy, and I'm happy to do that, like, because that's basically what I studied, is how you actually analyze policy to be more critical. And I'm happy to do another one of these where we can actually take policies and like talk about their impacts and really like tear it apart. But this is really great. This is, if you're interested in doing anything like that, this is a really critical book. And I have it tagged in some spaces, but this is a good one. If you're looking for, again, more policy stuff, obviously I loved this book, Reconstructing Policy in Higher Education. This one's fabulous. Again, it gives you ways in order to think about how problematic some of our policies are. And it uses critical scholars in order to dismantle policies that have been harmful and continue to be harmful. 3 more. This one's great. I don't know if any of you've read this one, The Plight of Invisibility by Dr. Kiyama and Harris. This one's fabulous, but this really also talks about the experiences of Latinx students in college and that narrative. And so, you know, we have to know our narrative in order to challenge it. If folks should not be giving us who we are. We should be walking and knowing who we are and sharing that. So this is another one. If you're interested in just the policy process, this is a good introduction to that. It's very basic, to the point. Good read to help you go to sleep. No, the person's actually really fun to read. And then this is one of my favorite policy books ever, The Policy Paradox. And this one in particular really helps me challenge policy. And so I really go to this one a lot. So those are some books that I have for you. So I'm sorry you didn't get to like put your combination plate together, but I hope it was fun and a different way of explaining it. I am here for any questions. Thank you so much for letting me talk to you all today. It was a lot, so I apologize for talking way too much more than I wanted, but thank you.
I would say like don't need to apologize. I think lots of great information for sure. So thank you so much, Doctora Garcia. I am wondering, I know we're a little past our time, so thanks for sticking around a little bit, but let's open it up for some questions. I do want to remind folks that this is being recorded. So either I can even stop the recording if this is something you're like, I don't want my question to be recorded, or you can send it to me and I can like maybe ask the question. But let's open it up for a couple questions, maybe if folks have some questions. So, and at this point you can unmute yourself and ask the question. So let's see if there are any.
I have a question. I don't know if any of these books that you've already recommended are good. I'm trying to figure out how to identify policies that are racist, basically, but in the institution. I don't know if any of these books you think would be very useful to help, like I just identify those policies.
Yeah, I would probably say, yeah, The Policy Paradox is going to make you think differently. And so I think that would be a good foundational one. It's kind of heavy on theory. So if you want more of an application, I would probably say these two, the Reconstructing Policy in Higher Education, because it'll probably give you like a framework to use, and then you can use those frameworks to look at policies. I studied critical discourse analysis, and there was, I used a framework. Dr. Carabine has the framework where it was like 10 steps. There was 10 steps for you to analyze a policy. And so if you would just go through the steps, you could analyze a policy to see, like, basically one of the questions was like, who's being left out? And you can write down, who are the students being left out? Who's being amplified? And what is their race? And so like, you could use like a model like that or a framework like that, which might help direct you into breaking down the policy. And so I'm happy to share, again, that was she used that policy or that framework for something very different, but I used that same methodology when I wrote my dissertation. So I'm happy to share that with you if you're interested. But this reconstructing one has lots of different frameworks for you to use to deconstruct some policies at your institution.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Do we have maybe another questions? And I guess we're kind of your time.
Oh,
I also want to be like conscious of that too. And I mean,
no,
I saw the folks
you.
need to
I'm
step
sorry.
out.
I just was going. I just kept going.
I'm all on this journey of trying to decolonize things, and I think time is one of those things that needs to be one of those things. So let's embrace it.
Totally, I agree with you.
Yes. Yeah. Other thoughts, ideas from some other folks, perhaps in the chat. Well, one of the things I always like to ask is about the like what our folks are like reading. So thank you so much for kind of like sharing some of those books, because for me it's like, oh great, like that's usually one of the questions that I get to ask. And you did mention about potentially doing another session on like the policy piece, I believe. So I was like, yes, I know I personally will love that. Well, folks, if there are any other questions, I do want to just again thank Doctora. Is it Doctora Ali Garcia? Am I pronouncing that correctly? Okay, I was just, pronunciation is always important for me. I do wanted to share, folks, we do have a couple other sessions coming up, so I am gonna put it on the chat box in case folks would like to maybe sign up for the next charla. There will be a quick kind of like assessment piece that will be, that Danielle will actually be like sending, and we'll for sure include some of the cultural capital document and Dr. Garcia, if you have any other resources, we'll be happy to send those through for participants as well. Yes, I guess I just want to thank you all for joining us, and